Hello, how are you guys doing today? This is Brayton, and today's video is going over rosemary oil and why it's not as promising as people think when it comes to helping with androgenic alopecia or hair loss in general, or even causing hair growth. Why I think it's a little overrated, and a lot of the studies have a lot of holes in them, and why they kind of fall flat on their face, and they're not as promising as people really deem them to be, especially like the 2% minoxidil versus the rosemary oil trial. I'll just kind of be going over that trial today. So not only am I going over rosemary oil in this video, but what to look for when you're looking through a study, who is peer reviewing the study, who is this person, like how many peer reviews have they done, is there bias? Is there certain things that stand out in this study when it comes to just reading it through in general? Like, what are you seeing? Is there things that stand out or different? Or some things just unnaturally or stand out or seem impossible or too good to be true, especially. So we'll just be kind of going over some of those things today as well, just to, to look out for. Let's hop right on into what even is rosemary oil. So rosemary, also known as Salvia rosmarinus, is a plant that falls into the sage family, also known as Lamaceae, if I am saying that right. They are species native to the Mediterranean area, so like Spain, Portugal, stuff like that. But we won't get into botany today. But we'll be kind of looking into the actual chemical in them that is kind of known for, or is thought to, grow hair or stop hair loss. Also known as 12-methoxycarnosic acid. I have said methyl so many times, I'm so used to saying just methyl and not methoxy. But yes, that is the main compound here that we're going to be looking into of the main thing that is going to be causing the hair growth, or the main compound in rosemary itself, rosemary oil, that's going to cause or have the potential to cause hair growth. Now, there's nothing really else I've seen in rosemary that may cause hair growth in general. Now, this is the closest compound that's going to be able to grow hair, for it has the antioxidant and antimicrobial properties that it has to actually, may have a chance at growing hair in general. Now, it does have a low molecular weight as well, around 342 Daltons, so that means it is able to pass the Dalton rule and be able to penetrate the scalp properly. Sometimes though, even things with higher molecular weights that are topically applied can still actually penetrate the scalp, usually through the sebaceous gland or even the hair follicle itself. But it's just seen sometimes things that have a higher molecular weight that pass the 400 Dalton rule just have a harder time actually getting to the androgen receptor or actually causing the effect itself. But sometimes things that are even higher in the molecular weight can still actually have an effect. For example, topical dutasteride. Even though I thought in the past that maybe that since its molecular weight is too high, it's not going to be as effective, but it can still actually get through the sebaceous glands and the hair follicle itself. But I still think that topical finasteride is going to be a better option just because it is lower molecular weight. But anyways, that's a off-topic thing here. We'll get back to the rosemary oil. Now, rosemary oil itself, I believe the average concentration of methoxycarnosic acid that's in rosemary oil is only around 20%. So that means that you're going to have to dose rosemary oil on the higher end here when it comes to actually having a proper, even comparing to something like finasteride, to even having maybe a hair growth effect from the antioxidant property that it may have, or the antimicrobial property that it may have. So already kind of iffy when it comes to the amount of rosemary oil that you're going to have to use when it comes to topically applying it here. And ingesting rosemary oil also is not a good thing as well, may be toxic. Now, we're going to get on to the main study here that I always seen cited all the time when it comes to rosemary oil being like a good supplement or topical to actually grow hair. And that is the study, right? I'll show it right here, the 2% minoxidil versus the rosemary oil. And so now we're kind of going to get into why there are some plot holes in this study. Now, first is the abstract. Now, sometimes with a lot of studies, you want just to read the abstract. That's what your brain is telling you because it's the easiest to digest. But the abstracts you can't always trust. Now, it doesn't hurt to read it, obviously, but you want to make sure that you are reading the entire study and you're looking through each kind of like nook and cranny when it comes to certain things. And it's not just the abstract, not just the conclusion, because you can be subjected to actual bias and some things that are being left out here. Because, even in studies, there's always going to be bias. It's going to be very difficult to actually have a proper, unbiased study there isn't financial motive or anything like that. So there are a lot of things you have to look for when it comes to studies, and especially even the publisher, people who are peer reviewing, financial motives, stuff like that. But Anyways, we're gonna get to the next biggest red flag here is why are they using 2% minoxidil over 5% minoxidil? Now, maybe in general, maybe they thought that rosemary oil is going to be weaker than 5% minoxidil. Maybe they wanted a better option. They want to compare it to something like 2% minoxidil. Maybe it has a better chance to show that, hey, maybe it does have a slight hair growth increase and then it looks better because it's a natural alternative. But even with so, and if you look at the before and afters on the hair count here, it is kind of suspiciously not any improvement at all. It's like a typo here. And even with these results, over a 6-month span, which is already a pretty short span. Now, hair does fluctuate seasonally when it comes to how much you shed and how much hair you have on your head during the time of the year. Now, in the springtime, you're going to have the most amount of hair. Now, when you're going towards the fall time, you're going to be shedding more hair and having less hair. It is just seasonal changing. So during the study time that it was taking place, it really is hard to figure out, was there even like the change that occurred? Is it even due to the rosemary or even due to the minoxidil? There was such a little change, and you have to take into account the seasonal changes here when it comes to how your hair is going through the hair growth cycle, what hairs were in the telogen phase. So the baseline hair count is just a little odd. And when it comes to even the before and after pictures, it's not even that drastic of a change. And it's almost as if like too little has changed, and it already seems a little suspicious on that end there. And a lot of other things that appear in this study are just little errors and typos that seem, well, everyone has typos and everyone has errors, but it just seems that like if this study was peer-reviewed, which it was, and it's cited so many times, with all these errors kind of and typos, it's just kind of odd to me. And also, I guess, as well, is the weird Norwood scale of depression. I've never seen the Norwood pattern, also the Hamilton pattern, be scaled as the Norwood scale of depression. That's also something a little odd as well. I guess the biggest red flag for me was just like the 2%. Why would you compare 2% minoxidil is not effective really at all? Why use it comparatively to something like 5% minoxidil? So not only is the study a little iffy, but other studies as well just don't seem to have great just findings, or just the studies are too short, or even of the peer reviewers are, not the most credible even sometimes, or it just seems like some things are out of place, or something is just like a little odd or a little fishy. And even if sometimes like some of the studies or a study here were against the topical finasteride is where rosemary oil may seem promising, but you have to use quite a lot of rosemary oil topically compared to, topical finasteride. This is due to the concentration of 12-methoxycarnosic acid in general when it comes to the rosemary oil. But that's not, sometimes rosemary is grown differently and it's not always the same. That's the kind of bad part when it comes to natural ingredients. Things don't always replicate very well, and that's why synthetic things exist. So they can fill in those holes and actually be replicated multiple times. While natural things, it's hard to replicate for, nature can sometimes be imbalanced when it comes to certain things, or how the rosemary is grown. It could affect the concentration actually of the 12-methoxycarnosic acid in general. So it can be kind of hard to pinpoint. So, you may have to use more topical rosemary oil to actually get that proper concentration. To may even have some hair growth effect, but at the end of the day, the topical finasteride is a different mechanism to the rosemary oil. The rosemary oil has antimicrobial activity, antioxidant activity, which may have some hair growth for, antioxidants may help with hair growth. Yeah, but, topical finasteride is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. It's cutting off DHT from binding to the androgen receptor. So completely two different mechanisms of action here. It may have some hair growth stimulating effects, but if you are suffering from androgenic alopecia, that rosemary oil is not going to do anything because it's not a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor like what finasteride is. Now, I guess you can compare maybe the minoxidil to the rosemary oil, but minoxidil's mechanism of action not completely known, though it is a potassium channel opener. That also is completely different than, rosemary oil. Now, I may be wrong, and when it comes to the antioxidant property of the 12-methoxycarnosic acid, for it could, may have some 5-alpha reductase inhibiting effects or hair growth stimulating effects like minoxidil, stamoxidine, or something like that. I just haven't seen that, and if I'm wrong, feel free to leave in the comments down below. But just from what I've seen, it's just a completely different mechanism from, these already treatments for hair loss that we have. So at the end of the day, it's not like I'm completely against rosemary oil, But I just think it's blown way out of proportion by not only just like dermatologists and trichologists online, but just many different people who, cite the studies that just have holes in them, and people don't properly read through them properly or don't look at the peer reviewers, and so many holes in these studies. And a lot of the people who support rosemary oil or support a certain product, they sometimes are selling it as well. So there's financial motive, and there's going to be bias at times. Now, not all the time, but it's common. So that's why I think rosemary oil is such a popular and controversial thing for hair growth, because it's pushed out there so much due to, the study that's very flashy and, that everyone likes to cite. But the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of rosemary oil is especially, things like telogen effluvium and androgenic alopecia. Now, telogen effluvium, a different story here. We'll get into that in a sec. But androgenic alopecia, if you use something like rosemary oil, it's not going to work, sadly. But the thing with androgenic alopecia, it's with time, you're on a clock. Because when you start to recede, those hairs, when they turn vellus and they slowly miniaturize to nothing, you can't get them back. You may help, like with the thinning hairs around that area, get thicker and maybe help cover that area, but you can't get the hairs that are miniaturized to nothing back. So you're on a clock. So sadly, something with androgenic alopecia, you just kind of have to use the most things that we know work, because you're on a clock and you don't want to waste that time and lose the hair that you can't get back. Obviously, it's up to you. If you're trying to keep your hair, though, you want to use the proven treatments and not try to, experiment around with things like the rosemary oil. Now, when it comes to telogen effluvium, now if you're, experiencing like a spot right here, you're losing a bunch of hair due to, a major diet change or whatever that's going on in your life that may cause a kind of like a patchy area on your scalp, and then you start using a remedy like rosemary oil to over time for a couple months, and then you start noticing, hair growth is coming back, and then you share online your anecdote, rosemary oil helped gain my hair back, grew back this patchy area of hair. Now, why that falls flat on its face is, well, it was telogen effluvium. It's temporary, and that's where a lot of these people online like to share their anecdotes where, this product, rosemary oil, grew my hair back from this to this. And most of the time, it was just telogen effluvium, and that hair was going to grow back anyways. Now, is there a possibility that the rosemary oil grew back more thicker, fuller hair than normally? Possibly, due to its antioxidant effect. But the amount they have to use for the rosemary oil to actually possibly have that is high, and most of the time is like your hair was just going through a hair growth cycle through the seasonal changes, and then it was just stuck into the telogen phase, and then all of a sudden it grows back, and a lot of people get the idea that the remedy that I used grew that hair back. And so that's why it's kind of hard to trust anecdotes here at the end of the day, and you have to have a controlled blind, double blind, placebo usually too, trial when it comes to this stuff. And that's properly peer-reviewed with proper financial backing as well when it comes to these studies for these products, because it's a mixed bag, and it can be really hard to figure out these things, even, for certain conditions. So that's just my stance here at the end of the day when it comes to rosemary oil, and why I'm just not the biggest fan of it, and why, I think it's overhyped and, pushed way too much. And, I see dermatologists even, and many people online trying to push it out there and be like, rosemary oil is effective as minoxidil, and then you see someone who's clearly suffering androgenic alopecia, and they're showing a product that contains rosemary oil in it, or just rosemary oil by itself, and they're like, it's gonna make your hair so much better, it's gonna get your hairline back, it's gonna make it super thick. That's just it just puts a bad taste in my mouth, because at the end of the day, it's most likely a scam. Or if you see a before and after, at least a dermatologist or a person's like, this is before and after using rosemary oil, and it's a crazy difference, that is not true. Even on finasteride or minoxidil, even dutasteride, even, you can't really get that crazy of a difference unless you are you respond to the drug very well, or it's rare to even get crazy before and afters with those unless you compound them together, use some crazy before stacks of stuff. So, and those things are pharmaceutical drugs, so you'd like to think there'd be some crazy before and after. So yeah. But yeah, end of the day, I think it's just a little too overhyped in my opinion, and especially when it comes to things like androgenic alopecia, you're on a clock. So I just don't recommend it. and it's just really not going to be worth even trying, I think. And it's really worth trying the things that we know work. I guess it's up to you, though. It's, you know, experiment how you will. That's just my opinion at the end of the day. And yeah, if you guys like this video, leave a like. And if I got anything wrong or I've left out, feel free to leave in the comments down below. All feedback is appreciated. You know, I could be missing something drastic here. You never know. But yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. And yeah, I will see you guys later.